Hi, I'm Deirdre Barrett, and I've been studying dreams for decades, to some extent everything about dreams, but especially dreams and creativity. Today I want to talk to you about some of my research on this, and then more personally about some of my own dream creativity. Creations as diverse as Dmitri Mendeleev's periodic table of the elements and Paul McCartney's song Yesterday came to their creators in dreams. And this is even though chemistry and music are not common elements of dreaming. But visual art receives the very best help from dreams. About 80% of artists told me they use dreams in their work, much higher than any other profession. This is because the state of our brains during dreaming involves the damping down of the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with logical linear thinking, and an increase in activity in the secondary visual cortex, where mental imagery is generated. Anthropologists believe some of the more surreal cave paintings represent dreams, so the history of dream art may be as long as the history of art. Visionary artists such as William Blake represented dreams in their paintings. And the surrealists especially emphasized dreams as the ideal source of imagery. This is Leonore Carrington's Crookley Hall, about her lifelong recurring nightmare of ghosts chasing her through her childhood home. This is Remedios Varo's Invention of Birds. And Salvador Dali especially advocated dozing in an armchair holding a key, so that when one dozed off, the noise of the key falling, as muscles relaxed, would awaken him so that he could recall sleep onset, hypnagogic dream imagery. This is his dream caused by the flight of a bee around a pomegranate, obtained that way. And cinema, as well as art, has used dream imagery profusely. Dali was commissioned to design the dream scenes for Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound. In this scene, he used imagery as dramatic as the curtain made of eyes, but also as subtle as the fact that the main character is barefoot in a setting where one would normally wear shoes. This scene is from Tarkovsky's Mirror. He uses several cinematic dream images. First of all, simply the bed being present often denotes dreaming. Then flying and floating occur much more often in dream scenes in film than in actual typical dreams, possibly because they're some of our favorite dreams. And the blurriness of the background, with only the important objects in focus, signals how different our attention in dreams is, sometimes with no background, often with no peripheral imagery. This scene from Akira Kurosawa's dreams featured a horned demon at right and also some giant dandelions. So I'd studied and written about dream art for years, and gradually got more and more interested in making art from my own dreams. I didn't initially feel confident enough with drawing or painting, so the first dreams I brought to life used photo collages, an effort that looks like darkroom double exposures, but achieved with layerings in Photoshop. This dream occurred a few months after my mother's death and was set in a church where her funeral had been held, also her mother's funeral. And in the dream, as I approached the church, there were flocks of black birds circling overhead in an ominous-seeming manner. But I went on into the church, where I saw my mother was seated in a pew midway down. And I found it very sad and distressing that she was continuing to attend church after her death. And I was inside, but still somehow aware of the black birds circling and circling over the roof of the church. Then I felt this wave of mortality sort of sweeping down through my female line, and thought of my great-grandmother, grandmother, my mother, and myself. And somehow the dark birds seem to represent this. So I made this triptych with different scenes from parts of the dream and bits of myself, my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother interspersed with the birds and the trees they were lighting in. Another photo collage was based on a dream I had in the early stages of the pandemic. And I began more to take photos new just for dreams rather than use ones I already had or some from the public domain, like the last image. So more and more I took specific photos for background, but then began to use the Photoshop tools of digitally drawing with their pen tool and painting with the brush tool to make the surreal creatures and people that were set in the scene. This is a dream in which I walked to Harvard Square late at night, discovering little animals lived on the roofs and only came down in the middle of the night, which delighted me. And I picked out two of my favorite buildings on that walk to take photographs of, and chose different moments in the dream to illustrate with each of them, and different of the little creatures and humanoid characters in those settings. For this dream of animals in a jungle that were sort of reenacting the whole cycle of life, dying, being born, mating, being friendly, predators eating prey, I first created a background of a fractal when I didn't find any very jungly foliage to photograph, and painted the creatures over that. And I'm still here using photography a bit because the snake skull over on the left side is a photo of one at the Harvard Biology Museum. But for another scene from the dream, I found a spot where the foliage fit the dream imagery pretty well, and took this photo and blurred it out to make it look more like the indistinct background had in my dream, and painted the creatures into this scene. And gradually I began to use the paint tools of Photoshop more and more, and photographic elements less. This one is my first with absolutely no photography, Light Ventures into the Light. And this was about a scene where I was looking at a sunlit garden with a newborn baby bird in it. But then, as only can happen in a dream, there was a night sky over the sunlit garden. And these two female creatures came down from the sky, and they were sort of made of night sky. They were blackness with hints of stars on them. And they began to feed pomegranates to the baby bird, which in the dream I saw completely as nurturing it, although upon awakening I do associate pomegranates with what brings you into the underworld. And that one actually won a national art contest, the Kessler Collection's Next Original. And the Kessler Collection displayed it on a billboard in Times Square this past New Year's Eve. This is my painting, A Stranger in Town. And in this, the creature on the right is arriving in this sort of deserty spot where others already live, and being eyed very suspiciously. And I drew some of the other creatures that I remembered from it, but what stood out the most was just all these eyes looking at him. So I drew extra eyes in there. This is Uninvited Guests, which was a dream where there were lots of bird-like people and birds on people, but the scene I really wanted to focus on was this moment when this woman, highlighted in blue, is standing there, and all of a sudden 2 owls light on her head. And she is so distressed and burdened by this development, but doesn't quite know what to do. So I was trying to capture her feeling in that moment in this digital painting. And like Dali, I enjoy sleep onset hypnagogic imagery. This is not captured with the key, but just naturally happened to wake up from it. And I had been looking at videos of the Northern Lights earlier that evening, and when I fell asleep, I began to see the lights dancing in front of me, but with faces forming momentarily in them and then evaporating and forming new faces. So, as I often do with my favorite dreams, I made 2 images of this because the faces were so different in character that I wanted to capture something of the variety. And I just named these Aurora Borealis 1 and Aurora Borealis 2. This is one of my most recent pieces, and in this, I dreamed that there was a woman with her dog who was in this area that looked like ancient Roman ruins. Awake, I associate this with the cisterns under Istanbul, Turkey. But in the dream, I first thought this was underground, but then I noticed that the columns went down towards slits that opened into cloudy sky, as if the whole thing was floating over the clouds. So I was confused about where we were. But then I noticed these people who I knew to be dead, who were calling out either to her or just in general, kind of distressed noises. And the woman, I realized, was just kind of frozen listening because she thought she heard something. And she was in this kind of trance-like state. But the dog, I knew, saw the dead people very clearly and heard them calling and is all realistic attention to what's going on. And then there were a few ghostly figures way off in the background that were maybe heading toward her also. And I was going to call this The Dead Cry Out in Dreams. I often name the pictures very straightforwardly for what the dream is. But when I was first showing this, not quite finished, to a lot of friends, I noticed that even more than with my other images, that everybody started telling me a story about what they saw in the dream. And none of them had dead people in them. None of them had to do even with these people calling out necessarily. Many of them were about the relationship between the woman and her dog. So I decided to give it the much more ambiguous title Echoes so that people could see some of what it stimulated in their imagination before hearing any dream account. And this is my very most recent. It's not even in my galleries yet, so it's debuting in this talk. And it's titled The Diving Bell. And it's about an unwanted voyage these guys were taking in a rusty bell attached to a very thin rope. They are being lowered into the depths of the ocean. And in the dream, they had already passed some other creatures nearer the surface. But the most powerful moment in the dream was when they got to an extreme depth and these giant sea snakes appeared. And to my eye, the snakes didn't necessarily look aggressive. They looked curious about the bell and if they were going to respond to it in any way. But the guys in the diving bell were increasingly miserable with the depth they were going to, the unreliable rope, and these giant snakes were just kind of the final blow to their morale. And one thing I consciously registered finally when making this image was something that had really been happening for a while, which was that I noticed that when I'm focusing on trying to make faces as realistically as I can, as I'm still kind of struggling to learn to sketch and paint. Um, I get more accurate faces, and the same for bodies if I'm focusing on getting them very realistic. But I don't get as good expressions in the faces or postures for the body. And that was okay with the woman in the previous image because she was in a sort of blank, frozen, trancy state anyway. So it was easy to paint her more realistically and not worry about the expression. But with these guys, I'd really learned to go for the expression I wanted, the extremely unhappy mouths, the kind of glazed over traumatized eyes. Both the expression I really saw and just what I could feel coming from these characters was what mattered. And that always ends up with a slightly more cartoonish effect, but the emotion feels the most important part of the dream. So this is the style that I think I'm now settled into and going forward with. And lastly, my most recent book, Dreams, which is about what people around the world were dreaming during the crisis. It was uniquely rewarding to be able to have my own image on the cover to accompany the writing that I've been doing for much longer about dreams.